Colombia in the 1990s was a country already bleeding. It bled from civil war, from cartel violence, from corrupt politics, and decades of internal displacement. Entire communities lived in the shadows of guerrilla warfare and narco-tyranny. In towns where the government was a whisper and justice a joke, survival often meant silence. And in that silence, something monstrous grew. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a breaking news report. There wasn't a headline that screamed "killer on the loose." No, it happened slowly, almost invisibly. A child didn't come home one evening. Another disappeared from the edge of a market. A third never made it to school. Rural families filed missing persons reports, if they even had the resources to do so. But these were poor children, boys from slums, displaced orphans, vendors' sons, street kids, children no one with power cared to count, and no one was connecting the dots. Not yet. Colombia's police were overwhelmed, its institutions crippled by corruption and political instability. And so for years, what should have been a national emergency, a pattern of hundreds of vanished boys, was dismissed as coincidence, or worse, ignored entirely, until the bodies began to appear. In October 1997, in the town of Genova, in the Quindío department, workers stumbled upon a mass grave in a hillside ravine. 3 skeletons, all of them boys, their wrists bound, their bodies mutilated, and carved into a tree nearby an eerie marker. A date, a symbol. More bodies followed. In empty fields, abandoned construction sites, coffee plantations, all bearing the same hallmarks: torture, sexual assault, and an overwhelming stench of evil. Forensic teams, overwhelmed by the frequency and brutality of the discoveries, began to suspect a serial killer, something rare in Colombian criminal history. But this wasn't just rare, it was unprecedented. By the time national authorities began coordinating databases and cross-checking missing children reports, the number of bodies was rising rapidly. 20, 40, 70, then over 100. And finally, they caught a name whispered in the criminal underworld: Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, the man who would later be known as La Bestia, the Beast. He did not look like a monster. He was slight, bespectacled, and wore second-hand clothes. He could have been mistaken for a traveling salesman or a teacher. But beneath his awkward smile and soft-spoken voice was something few could comprehend. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born on January 25, 1957, in Genova, Quindío, a poor town nestled in the Andean Mountains. His early life was a cocktail of poverty, physical abuse, and psychological ruin. His father was a violent alcoholic who humiliated and beat him. From a young age, Garavito was sexually abused, not just by family members, but also by strangers. He never completed high school. He drifted, from job to job, from town to town, and with each passing year, his desires twisted further. By the early 1990s, Garavito had become a professional drifter. He posed as a priest, a street vendor, a charity worker. He gained the trust of vulnerable boys, promising food money or school supplies. Once isolated, he would tie them up, blindfold them, rape them, and torture them before finally ending their lives, sometimes with a blade, sometimes by snapping their necks. But that wasn't all. He kept notes. He marked dates, locations. He collected small trophies. He moved constantly, never staying in one town long enough to raise suspicion. His method was calculated. His pattern hard to track, especially in a country where child disappearances were chalked up to gang recruitment, family neglect, or guerrilla kidnappings. Garavito knew this. He exploited it. In some towns, he posed as a handicapped man limping to gain sympathy. In others, he masqueraded as a traveling monk offering prayer and protection. Parents let him near their children. Boys trusted his calm voice and candy-filled pockets. Then they vanished, one by one, sometimes 3 in a single weekend. His killing grounds spanned the entire country, from Valle del Cauca to Boyacá, from the Pacific coast to the interior mountain towns. Authorities later identified at least 140 confirmed murder sites, but estimates suggest his victim count may have reached 300. 300! That would make Luis Garavito the most prolific serial killer in modern recorded history, eclipsing names like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and André Chikatilo. But in Colombia, he remained unknown for far too long. It wasn't until 1999, when forensic analysts matched a pair of broken glasses found near one of the crime scenes to a rare prescription that they got their first real lead. The glasses were traced to a clinic in Valle del Cauca, a city Garavito had visited. From there, a facial composite was drawn, wanted posters distributed. Slowly, the manhunt began. And then came the break. On April 22, 1999, in the town of Villavicencio, police arrested a disheveled man attempting to assault a boy in a public park. He gave a fake name, Bonifacio Morera, but the ID was forged. Something didn't add up. Authorities dug deeper. Fingerprints were run, photos compared. The man in custody, slight, polite, and seemingly harmless, was no ordinary offender. He was La Bestia, Luis Alfredo Garavito. And when police raided his belongings, they found a chilling collection notebooks with dates, names, and codes, maps with marked locations, newspaper clippings about missing children, bottles of cheap liquor, pornographic drawings, a list scrawled in his own hand of places visited and tasks completed. He kept a log of his murders like a trucker tracks miles. In the following weeks, Garavito would confess not out of remorse, but calculation. He cooperated, giving dates and locations. He led police to more remains. He laughed, sometimes wept. Other times he prayed. But always he insisted I was sick. I needed help. The man they brought into the Villavicencio police station on April 22, 1999, did not look like a monster. He was slight, middle-aged. He wore second-hand clothes and had thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a stutter. If anything, he looked like someone's confused uncle, the kind of man you might pass in the street without a second glance. But beneath the surface of Luis Alfredo Garavito was something the world had rarely seen before. When investigators sat him down, he introduced himself calmly as Bonifacio Morera Lizcano, an alias. He handed them a forged ID, said he was unemployed, homeless, looking for work. But as they pressed him about the attempted assault on a young boy in the park, his story began to fray, then unravel. Fingerprints taken at the scene were run through the national database. Within hours, the results returned. The man they were holding wasn't just a petty criminal. He was the ghost that had haunted Colombian soil for nearly a decade. He was La Bestia. When confronted, Garavito didn't deny it. He didn't beg for mercy. He asked for a cigarette, and then with a calm that chilled the detectives to their bones, he said, "If I talk, you won't sleep again." What followed was a confession that would reshape Colombian criminal history forever. Garavito admitted to killing at least 140 boys, but he hinted at many more, 200, maybe 3. The exact number he said he could not remember, but he kept records, and he would help them find the bodies if they treated him with respect. Over the following weeks, Garavito sat with investigators in a series of long, disturbing sessions. The tape recorders rolled as he described in clinical detail how he chose his victims, how he lured them with candy promises of work or false charity, how he tied them up, tortured them, assaulted them, and ultimately killed them. In some cases, he recited the victims' names from memory. In others, he guided police to burial sites that had never been found. He was calm, helpful, at times even jovial. He laughed when describing how he evaded capture. He seemed proud of the deception, the way he changed clothes, appearances, identities. He mocked the police for their slowness. "I walked through your cities," he said. "You never saw me." Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate him. What they encountered defied categories. Luis Garavito wasn't insane, not in the legal sense. He was not psychotic. He understood right from wrong. He was capable of remorse, or at least capable of pretending. But what he lacked was empathy, conscience. He was a textbook organized sexual sadist with antisocial personality disorder and deeply entrenched pedophilic fixation. And yet, unlike many serial killers, Garavito was not impulsive. He was meticulous. He traveled with maps. He scouted locations. He kept track of local holidays, knowing when boys would be out of school. He avoided places with strong police presence. He chose his victims with care, the poorest of the poor, often homeless, or from broken families whose disappearances would stir little media attention. He even targeted areas affected by conflict, knowing that in war zones, missing children were often blamed on paramilitary groups or guerrilla fighters. In other words, he knew exactly what he was doing. Still, Garavito wanted something. He wanted understanding. He told police he had been abused as a child, repeatedly. that he'd been forced to witness acts no child should see, that he had tried to seek help many times but was turned away. He claimed he went to a priest, a counselor, a teacher. All of them failed him, and now he said he was a product of that pain. He even cried. But were the tears real, or was it just performance? Forensic psychologists debated his sincerity. Some believed he was trying to manipulate the system to be seen as a victim, not a monster. Others believed that in his own twisted worldview, the abuse had justified the violence, that he had rationalized his crimes as some form of retribution against the world. He kept returning to one phrase, the beast inside me. He described it as a second self, a force that took over when he was angry or drunk, a hunger, a darkness. When the beast woke, he said, "I had no control," but his methodical patterns suggested otherwise. Garavito was sober during many of the murders. He prepared his killing kits in advance. He brought restraints knives, and in some cases alcohol to get the victims drunk. He always brought extra clothes so he could leave the scene clean and unnoticed. The evidence told a different story than the man did, and what was most terrifying was how long it took to stop him. At the time of Garavito's confession, Colombia had no national DNA database, no child abduction protocols, and no centralized investigative task force for serial murder. Many missing children reports were never filed, or worse, never read. In some towns, the police hadn't even realized the children were gone. And Garavito exploited every gap. He used dozens of aliases, changed towns constantly, moved across department lines. Some jurisdictions suspected something was wrong, but no one saw the full picture until it was too late. In the courtroom, Garavito did not deny his guilt. He confessed. But when prosecutors moved to sentence him, they were shackled by Colombian law, which at the time did not allow life imprisonment or the death penalty. The maximum sentence under the Penal Code, 30 years. Even with additional charges, Garavito's sentence was capped at 853 years, but due to legal limitations, he would serve only 40. And because of good behavior, there was a possibility of release in 2023. The public reaction was nuclear. Protests erupted. News anchors wept. Victims' families threatened to burn the prison to the ground. Colombia's Congress was flooded with petitions to change the law. But it was too late for retroactive sentencing. Luis Alfredo Garavito, the worst serial killer the modern world has ever known, was in prison, but technically not for life. And what was worse, he believed he'd changed. In prison, Garavito became a model inmate. He read the Bible, wrote letters to psychiatrists, asked for therapy, claimed he had found God. He spoke of opening a foundation for abused children, a suggestion that horrified the world. He told reporters, "I want to make amends." But can you make amends for 300 murdered children? When the headlines finally hit, "Serial killer confesses to 140 murders," the country stopped cold. Colombia, a nation already steeped in blood from decades of guerrilla warfare and cartel executions, suddenly found itself confronting a different kind of evil. This wasn't political. This wasn't about money or drugs. This was about innocence, children, and the man who had confessed to hunting them. Luis Alfredo Garavito was no longer just La Bestia. He became a symbol, a stain, a black mark on the soul of a country that had failed its most vulnerable. His face, once unremarkable, was now seared into public memory. But what truly ignited national rage was not just the scale of his crimes, it was the sentence. Colombian law, as written at the time of Garavito's arrest, had a hard cap on sentencing 30 years. Even with multiple charges stacked together, the legal limit for consecutive sentencing was 40 years, and even that was only due to reforms made in 2000 after Garavito's crimes had come to light. And with good behavior, he might be eligible for parole even earlier. The thought of the world's most prolific child murderer ever walking free again was too much for Colombians to stomach. Outrage spread like wildfire. Talk shows flamed with fury. Protesters lined the streets outside the prison. Families of the victims sobbed on national television, holding photographs of their sons begging the government to change the law. News anchors barely held back tears as they read his confession aloud. In Bogotá, the capital, thousands of signatures were gathered in a single weekend, demanding a constitutional amendment to allow life imprisonment for crimes of this magnitude. And yet, because Colombia's legal framework did not permit retroactive punishment, there was no way to apply the new law to Garavito's sentence. He had confessed, he had cooperated, and under the system as it stood, he had rights. To many, it felt like a second crime. Outside Colombia, the world reacted with disbelief. Human rights organizations, psychologists, legal scholars, all tried to make sense of it. How could a man confess to hundreds of child murders and still be legally entitled to parole? Some argued that Garavito's case exposed a philosophical flaw in Colombia's justice system, a model based on rehabilitation over retribution. A belief that every man, no matter how lost, could change. But could this man? In prison, Garavito was a model inmate. He attended therapy, studied theology, took part in rehabilitation programs. He told interviewers he had accepted Jesus Christ. He said he wanted to help prevent future abuse. Incredibly, at one point, he applied to start a charity foundation to help victims of abuse, a request so disturbing it triggered a new wave of national anger. Many saw it as manipulation, a performance, an attempt to rewrite his own story, from predator to victim, from monster to martyr. And behind all the legal debate, the political posturing and the media firestorm, the families of the murdered boys waited and grieved. The parents of Lorenzo Martinez, a 12-year-old who disappeared in 1996, said they would rather die than ever see Garavito released. The mother of Jairo Soto, abducted from a market in Pereira, said there is no prison strong enough for the pain he caused. But in Garavito's own mind, justice had been served. He told one reporter, "I helped find the bodies. I told the truth. I asked for forgiveness. What more can I do?" He believed that because he cooperated, because he showed remorse, that he had fulfilled his debt to society. That belief terrified the world. Because it wasn't just about one man. It was about a system that allowed him to believe it. Colombia's Congress responded swiftly. In 2006, they passed legislation allowing life imprisonment for crimes involving sexual violence against minors. The new law also improved coordination between police departments, mandated the creation of a national child abduction alert system, and expanded forensic capabilities. But for many, the reforms came too late. Garavito remained in prison, but untouched by the new laws. His sentence stood. And unless something changed, he would one day walk free. Then in 2021, as whispers of his potential early release surfaced, the country again exploded in protest. Justice Minister Wilson Ruiz was forced to issue a public statement saying, "This man is not going anywhere. We will use every legal mechanism to ensure he remains behind bars." Behind the scenes, the government explored options to civilly commit Garavito should his sentence ever expire by declaring him a public threat or mentally unfit for reintegration. But the fact that such discussions even needed to happen, that the question of his release was not automatically dismissed, revealed just how fragile justice could be. And through it all, Garavito remained largely silent. He gave few interviews. One of the most notable was in 2006 to a journalist named Guillermo Prieto Larrota, known as Piri. In the interview, Garavito described how he committed his crimes, how he cried after the murders, how he regretted what he'd done, but his eyes told a different story. Cold, detached, calculating. Piri later said, "I was looking into the eyes of a man who knew exactly what he had done, and I didn't see remorse. I saw satisfaction. This wasn't about redemption. This was about legacy." Garavito wanted to be remembered. Not just as a killer, but as someone who had overcome his past. It was the ultimate insult to the families he destroyed. And yet, despite all this, the system still held. As of the end of 2022, Garavito was still alive, still incarcerated, and still eligible for future consideration. He remained, for better or worse, a test of how far a justice system rooted in rehabilitation can stretch before it breaks. But in 2023, rumors of his declining health began to circulate. Cancer, internal bleeding, the frailty of a man whose crimes had once seemed unstoppable. Then finally, Luis Alfredo Garavito died on October 12, 2023 from terminal cancer at the age of 66. And with his death, a question still remained. Was justice finally served? When Luis Alfredo Garavito died on October 12, 2023, there was no national moment of silence. There were no flowers, no mourning, no candlelight vigils. There was instead a muted sense of relief, a grotesque chapter of history finally closing. A man whose very name had become synonymous with evil was gone. Dead from cancer in a prison hospital, his body quickly cremated and buried without ceremony. But the story didn't die with him. It can't. Because what Luis Garavito did and what allowed him to do it still echoes in the institutions, the towns and the homes where his victims once lived and dreamed and vanished. We remember their names, if we can find them, but many remain unknown. Too many were never reported missing. Too many were buried in unmarked graves discovered years after their deaths, with no one to claim them. These were boys on the margins, street, kids, migrants, orphans whose disappearance the world barely registered. The true number of Garavito's victims may never be known. His confessions named 140. Investigators confirmed over 190 through forensic evidence. But his own notebooks suggested more than 300. 300 children, and not a single one of them received the media attention or national mourning they deserved. Because in Colombia, at that time, they were invisible. And that perhaps is the most terrifying part of this story. Luis Alfredo Garavito was able to become the most prolific serial killer in modern history, not because he was brilliant, not because he was lucky, but because his victims were poor, forgotten, disposable in the eyes of the system. The state failed them. Society failed them. The media, so quick to sensationalize violence, largely ignored their disappearances until a killer's face could sell headlines. And when the bodies were finally found, when the full horror was laid bare, the questions that should have shattered the country were quietly buried. How many boys died before anyone noticed? How many more could have been saved? And what does it say about us that we let it happen? Because while the man himself is gone, the conditions that allowed him to thrive still exist in many corners of the world. Broken institutions, neglected children, untracked missing persons, apathy cloaked in bureaucracy. In Colombia, the Garavito case became the catalyst for a series of legal reforms. A new national missing child database, a child alert system similar to the Amber Alert in the US, tougher sentencing laws including life imprisonment for serial sexual crimes against minors, enhanced tracking and coordination between police departments, psychological training for educators to spot signs of grooming and abuse. These changes saved lives, but they came far too late for the hundreds Garavito murdered. And even now, years later, the justice they promised is not guaranteed. Rural areas still struggle with missing children cases. Many families still don't trust the police. The scars of war and corruption run deep, and predators like Garavito still find ways to hide in the gaps. His case has become a study in criminal psychology, his behaviors dissected in law schools and investigative training programs. He is cited alongside Bundy Chikatilo and Dahmer, not because of what he represents, but because of what he reveals. That the greatest evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it walks with a limp, offers you a piece of candy and speaks softly about God. And that evil is most dangerous not when it is powerful, but when it is ignored. In the final years of his life, Garavito continued to insist he had changed. He painted himself as a reformed man. He gave interviews talking about forgiveness, about faith, about wanting to help the next generation. But the survivors, the families of his victims, never bought it. To them, he would always be La Bestia, a man who turned pain into purpose, who walked the cities and back roads of Colombia with a bag of rope, a bottle of liquor, and an appetite for horror. A man who did not just murder, but hunted, and who kept trophies like memories. Some have asked, was he the worst human to ever live? That's a question for historians, criminologists, theologians. But what we can say with no doubt is this: he left behind a crater in the conscience of a country. He forced a reckoning. He revealed how fragile the systems of protection truly are, and how easily evil can thrive in silence. This documentary is not just about a killer. It's about the cost of not caring. It's about the invisible children in every country, in every city whose absence goes unnoticed. It's about the way institutions collapse under the weight of apathy. And it's about what happens when one man sees that and takes full advantage. We remember Luis Alfredo Garavito not to honor him, but to make sure no one like him ever thrives again. Because monsters do not come from fairy tales. Sometimes they come from us, from our failures, from our silence, from our refusal to look. And the only way to stop the next one is to never forget the last.